Just a temp. That's what Dr. Marcus Ashford had said to his resident that morning, barely glancing at the woman changing 4 bags in Bay 4. Just a temp. They come and go. Don't bother learning their names. He didn't know that Rachel Torres had spent the previous 20 years disappearing, that she'd perfected the art of being invisible so thoroughly that even when she stood directly in front of you, you saw through her. He didn't know that the scarred hands moving with mechanical precision through the trauma unit had once held a bleeding child in Tikrit while sniper rounds punched through concrete above her head. And he had no idea that 3 months from now, he'd be begging the board for mercy while federal agents snapped handcuffs around his wrists in front of a lobby full of witnesses. The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart's trauma unit hummed their constant mechanical prayer as Rachel Torres clocked in at 6:41 a.m., 12 minutes before her shift officially began. She hung her jacket in a locker with the same careful precision she applied to everything, each movement economical, nothing wasted. The locker door closed with a soft click. Her name tag was already on her scrubs, printed in clinical sans serif, R. Torres, trauma nurse, temp. 3 months she'd been wearing that designation. 3 months of double shifts, of covering call-outs, of the worst hours nobody else wanted, and not once had she complained or asked for anything beyond her hourly rate. The unit smelled like antiseptic layered over floor wax, with undertones of something metallic that never quite washed away, the ghost of 1,000 hemorrhages. She breathed it in without flinching. Bay 1 through Bay 6 were arranged in a semicircle around the central nursing station where the monitors beeped their constant digital surveillance. Everything in the unit was cold tile floors, cold stainless steel tables, cold white walls that reflected the fluorescent glare like a surgical theater designed by someone who'd never heard of comfort. Rachel moved through the space with a slight favor to her left side, the old wound in her hip barely visible to anyone who wasn't looking specifically for it. Her gait had a precise quality, measured and deliberate, like someone who'd trained herself to move through hostile territory and never lost the habit. The night shift nurse, Dennis, handed her the census board without meeting her eyes. Nobody in the unit really looked at Rachel anymore. After 3 months of being the invisible temp, she'd become exactly that, part of the infrastructure, like the machines that went beep and were and sometimes alarmed in that flat electronic voice, check patient. She spent the first hour of her shift completing rounds on the 5 patients already in beds, a 62-year-old with a perforated ulcer waiting for surgery, a 28-year-old motorcyclist with bilateral femur fractures, an elderly woman with sepsis from a UTI that had spiraled into something more serious. Rachel's hands moved through the work with the kind of automation that only comes from repetition. She checked 4s, recorded vitals, adjusted the bear hugger warming blanket on Bay 3, marked intake and output on charts. The work was invisible work. Nobody noticed when she did it right. They only noticed when something went wrong, and by then, the problem had usually been festering for hours. Dr. Marcus Ashford arrived during morning rounds at 8:15 a.m., and the entire unit shifted its energy like a school of fish responding to the shadow of a predator passing overhead. His shoes were expensive, Italian leather that clicked against the tile with a rhythm that announced his arrival before he came into visual range. He wore a white coat that looked pressed that morning, probably still smelling faintly of the dry cleaner on 5th Avenue that handled the garments of San Diego's medical elite. Behind him came the resident, a nervous young woman named Dr. Chen who carried the attendings chart and wore the expression of someone constantly braced for criticism. Ashford was talking as he walked, his voice carrying the low, confident drawl of a man accustomed to being listened to without interruption. Operational excellence, he was saying, is not negotiable. It's the foundation of this unit's reputation. Everyone understands. The resident nodded quickly. He didn't require actual responses. The clinic nurses who'd been with the unit for years, Stephanie, Miguel, Karen, they straightened their postures as he passed, busying themselves with tasks that suddenly required their complete attention. Rachel glanced up from the medication cart where she was restocking supplies, made brief eye contact with Ashford, and returned to her work without expression. He didn't seem to register her presence at all. His gaze moved past her like she was a piece of furniture that happened to be in the way. The rounds proceeded in their choreographed pattern. Ashford would stop at each bed, ask pointed questions designed to demonstrate his superior clinical thinking, make decisions that the resident would dutifully record. He had a way of positioning himself so that he became the center of attention in every room, shoulders back, chin slightly elevated, the physical language of someone who'd never once doubted his own authority. When he stopped in bay for where the motorcyclist was recovering, Rachel happened to be adjusting the 4 pump, and she felt his attention land on her for precisely 3 seconds before it moved elsewhere. "Temp staff," he said to the resident, not to Rachel. "Make sure they're following protocol. They don't always understand the level of precision we maintain here." "Of course, Dr. Ashford," the resident said. Rachel didn't respond. She simply finished her adjustment, noted the infusion rate in the chart, 12 milliliters per hour, lactated ringers, and moved to the next bed. This was part of the invisible work too. Not responding. Not defending herself. Not creating waves that might cause someone in administration to notice her. The best temp was the kind nobody remembered after the shift ended. But at 10:43 a.m., everything changed. The trauma alert came through the overhead system with its characteristic urgency, the announcer's voice cutting through the unit's routine like a siren. "Trauma alert, 10 minutes out. Male, age 26, Special Forces amputee, femur wound complications, transferring from NMCSD. Bed assignment pending." The room went into immediate motion. Trauma alerts were different from regular admits. They came with adrenaline and the understanding that the next few hours would probably be difficult. Rachel moved with the rest of the team to prepare a bed, drawing supplies, checking the code cart, ensuring that every piece of equipment was exactly where it needed to be. But something about the patient description had caught her attention. Special Forces. Amputee from Tikrit. She kept her face neutral while her hands worked, gathering 14-gauge angiocath needles, checking the crash cart's medications, confirming the defibrillator pads were intact. Pain was information. Coincidence was just what connected 2 pieces of information that your nervous system hadn't yet recognized as related. The patient arrived via ambulance at 10:56 a.m., and Dr. Ashford positioned himself at the center of the receiving area with the authority of a man who'd choreographed this dance 100 times before. The paramedics wheeled in a young man in a wheelchair. He had only one leg below the knee, his left side ending in a surgical stump wrapped in fresh dressing. The patient's face was pale but focused, and his eyes moved through the room with a kind of tactical assessment that Rachel recognized immediately. Special Forces bearing. Still in combat mode even after everything else had been stripped away. "Name?" Ashford demanded, and the paramedic began rattling off vitals and history. "Derek Chen, 26 years old, transferred from Naval Medical Center San Diego for secondary wound assessment, sustained his amputation 3 years prior in Tikrit. Current concern is possible pseudoaneurysm development in the remaining femoral vasculature, transferred to acute care for imaging and possible intervention." Ashford nodded sharply, absorbing information like a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. "Get him to Bay 2. Full workup. I want a femoral ultrasound within the hour and lab stat." He turned to Rachel without really looking at her. "You take intake. Get vitals, get a full history, make sure the paperwork is complete. And Torres, follow protocol. No improvisation." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered to someone he'd already decided was beneath his notice. Rachel helped wheel Derek Chen into Bay 2, and something about the way he looked at her in that moment, really looked at her, meeting her eyes directly, made the hairs on her arms stand up. She'd spent 3 months being invisible in this unit, slipping through the spaces between people's attention like smoke. But Derek Chen's gaze was different. It was the gaze of someone trained to see what was actually there, not what they expected to see. She began the intake process with quiet efficiency. Name, date of birth, military affiliation, medical history. Derek answered her questions in short, precise sentences, his voice steady, the voice of someone who'd been trained to deliver information under stress. Rachel's own voice stayed soft and deferential, the voice of a temp nurse who knew her place in the hierarchy. But when she was adjusting his monitors and her sleeve rode up slightly, exposing a thin white scar that ran from her wrist toward her elbow, Derek's eyes tracked the movement. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of his attention. "How long?" he asked quietly. Rachel pulled her sleeve back down without breaking rhythm. "Excuse me. How long were you there?" "In the service." She didn't answer immediately. She finished recording his heart rate, 74, steady, strong, before she said anything at all. When she did speak, her voice was even quieter than before. "That's not something we discuss, Mr. Chen." "I know," he said. "But I know someone when I see them. And I think you do too." The door to Bay 2 opened before Rachel could respond, and Dr. Ashford swept in with the resident in tow, his presence immediately commanding the room's energy. He glanced at Derek without real warmth, the way a mechanic might regard a particularly complex engine problem. "Mr. Chen. Welcome to Sacred Heart. I'm Dr. Marcus Ashford, director of this trauma unit. We're going to take excellent care of you here, but it's going to be on our terms, with our protocols, understood?" Derek nodded slightly, but his eyes found Rachel where she stood near the pump, and there was something in that look, recognition, maybe, or the understanding that they were both people who understood what it meant to be far from where you started, pretending to be something you weren't, waiting for the moment when the truth would no longer stay hidden. Ashford watched Rachel's face for exactly 1 second, the moment her attention seemed to shift, the instant her focus moved from the standard professional distance to something more present, more engaged. It was barely perceptible, a micro-expression that lasted less than a heartbeat. But he saw it. And in that second, Dr. Marcus Ashford recognized something that made his jaw tighten. There was history here. There was something between this patient and this temp nurse that had nothing to do with the unit's protocols or operational excellence. And in Ashford's experience, personal investment was the enemy of control. He made a mental note. This would need attention. The fluorescent lights continued their mechanical hum as Rachel returned to her work, her face once again a perfect blank, her hand steady as she recorded Derek's vitals on the chart. But something had shifted in the unit's atmosphere. The invisible temp nurse had briefly become visible, and Dr. Marcus Ashford had noticed. What happened next would change everything, though none of them knew it yet. The morning of Derek Chen's second day at Sacred Heart, Rachel was adjusting his femoral catheter when Dr. Ashford entered with Derek's parents in tow. The sedation Rachel had documented showed Derek's pain management protocol was generating spike readings, his cortisol elevating, his heart rate erratic during rest periods. The medication Ashford had prescribed was standard, but not optimal. Not for this patient. Not for someone whose nervous system had been shattered by shrapnel and shock. The current morphine dosing, Rachel said quietly, keeping her voice level and clinical, might benefit from adjustment. His metabolic markers suggest his compensating. A slight increase in the fentanyl patch, paired with reduced morphine boluses, would stabilize his baseline without causing respiratory depression. The room went still. Derek's mother froze mid-breath. His father's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition. That was the voice of someone who knew what she was talking about. Dr. Ashford turned slowly. His smile was surgical precision. "Miss Torres, perhaps you'd like to share your medical degree with us?" "Oh wait, you don't have one." He turned to Derek's parents with the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to controlling narratives. "Our temporary staff sometimes forget their place. They see monitors and charts and believe it grants them clinical authority. It doesn't." Rachel's jaw tightened. A single muscle at her temple flexed once, then released. She said nothing. Her hands continued their work, checking the foresight, adjusting the warming blanket with movements that carried the efficiency of someone who'd done this in sandstorms with mortar rounds walking closer with each impact. Derek watched her. His eyes tracked every motion of her scarred fingers, every shift in her breathing pattern. Something in his chest had recognized something in hers the moment she'd entered his room, and now that recognition was deepening into certainty. The next morning, when Rachel arrived for her shift, the unit board had been updated. A dry erase marker had rendered her name in clinical notation, R. Torres, protocol violations, insubordination, questioning physician orders, 3/14. It was visible to all staff, all visitors, all families waiting in the lobby. It was professional assassination executed with the precision of a surgeon's blade. By lunch, the nickname had crystallized, temp nurse. Never her name. Always with a dismissive edge, the way you'd reference a piece of equipment scheduled for disposal. Rachel sat in the break room with a container of rice and grilled chicken, her usual meal. She'd learned long ago that predictability was safer than variation. The fluorescent lights hummed their anxious frequency above her head. Within 15 seconds, she counted, because counting was control, the table emptied. 2 nurses grabbed their food without a word. Jennifer, the one Rachel had helped comfort after a difficult pediatric loss 2 weeks earlier, gathered her salad and relocated to the far corner without meeting her eyes. The whispers started immediately. Low. Deliberate. Designed to be heard but not directly addressed. Thinks she knows better than a physician. Temporary staff never understand boundaries. Did you see the board? Rachel ate mechanically. Protein, carbohydrates, hydration. Fuel. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing remained steady. The trembling that might have erupted from another person never came, because trembling was a luxury, and she'd spent 20 years learning to live without luxuries. She'd held a child's hand in a building that was actively collapsing. She'd held a soldier's intestines inside his abdominal cavity while awaiting surgical evacuation. A break room full of nurses whispering was not going to fracture her. But that wasn't the worst part. The pattern repeated the next day. And the day after. The room physically cleared when she entered. Jennifer would actually gather her meal mid-bite and relocate. It was choreographed ostracism, the kind that was deniable if anyone complained, because no one had directly spoken a cruel word. No one had violated any policy. They'd simply exercised the right to choose their company. And their choice was clear: Rachel Torres was contagious. 3 days into this isolation, the real humiliation crystallized during morning rounds. Ashford was reviewing charts with the intensity of a man preparing an argument. Derek's room contained his parents, now permanent fixtures, and they watched as Ashford's eyes narrowed on the nursing notes. There. A 30-minute charting delay from Rachel's previous shift. A gap where medication administration time should have been documented immediately. Ashford's voice filled the room like music composed specifically for cruelty. Perhaps temporary staff don't understand we have standards here. He didn't look at Rachel, that would have been too direct, too honest. Instead, he addressed Derek's parents, his tone the pedagogical softness of a man explaining a simple concept to children. In a real hospital, documentation matters. It's not optional. It's not something you address when you find time between personal distractions. But I suppose when you're just passing through, excellence isn't really the goal, is it? Derek's mother shifted uncomfortably. His father's face had gone very still. Derek himself was staring at Rachel with an intensity that would have burned through steel. Rachel's hands continued their work. She took one measured breath, in through her nose, the antiseptic smell of the room, the copper undertone of blood and saline, the metallic tang of stainless steel, and then out, slowly, controlled. A single tear escaped her right eye, a physical response she couldn't suppress but refused to acknowledge. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Ashford. When she spoke, her voice carried the flatness of someone stating fact rather than defending herself. I understand standards better than you know, Doctor. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's wheeze, the cardiac monitor's steady beep, the fluorescent light's anxious hum. Ashford's face flushed, not with anger, but with something more dangerous, the realization that his contempt had failed to land. She hadn't crumbled. She hadn't apologized. She hadn't even raised her voice. She'd simply stated something that sounded like a promise. Rachel returned to checking Derek's vitals, her hands steady as surgical lasers, as if the previous exchange had been no more significant than the weather. Her fingers moved across his skin with the kind of gentleness that came from having held lives in those hands before, from having felt the last pulse of a soldier's carotid artery fading beneath her fingertips. Ashford stood there for 3 additional seconds, she counted again, always counting, and then stormed from the room with the gait of someone whose authority had been questioned in front of witnesses. Derek's father leaned forward slightly. That charting delay, he said quietly. Was that her mistake, Doctor? But Ashford was already gone. An hour later, Rachel was alone in the supply closet. The space was narrow, lined with sterile packages and medication boxes, and it smelled like industrial bleach mixed with the ghost of latex. She pressed her forehead against the cold metal shelving, letting the temperature pull heat from her skin. Her dog tag was visible at her collar, a single tag on a broken chain, the kind of thing a person wore either because they hadn't had time to replace it or because they couldn't bear to let go of what it represented. The back of that tag carried an engraving, a child's name. A name that had belonged to a boy in Tikrit 20 years ago, a boy she'd pulled from rubble under sniper fire, a boy whose father was now watching her with eyes that recognized something he thought he'd lost forever. But that recognition couldn't matter. That recognition was a liability. That recognition was going to get her killed if she wasn't careful. Outside the supply closet, in his office 3 corridors away, Dr. Marcus Ashford was making phone calls with the casual precision of a man conducting business as usual. His voice was low and measured. "I may need your support on a staffing matter," he told the first caller, a board member who owed him 3 favors. "Nothing urgent. Just laying groundwork. Competence concerns. Cultural fit issues. You know how these things work." He paused, listening. "Exactly. Patience. We document everything, file it properly, and then when the time comes, the decision looks inevitable rather than personal." He hung up and made another call. Then another. Each conversation planted a seed, watered it with professional concern, and moved on. By the end of the afternoon, 3 board members had absorbed the narrative that Rachel Torres was a well-meaning but fundamentally problematic addition to the trauma unit. Nothing severe. Nothing actionable yet. Just a concerning pattern that responsible leadership should monitor. Dr. Ashford smiled at his reflection in the window overlooking San Diego's skyline. He'd built Sacred Heart's trauma program from nothing. He'd made himself indispensable through a combination of clinical excellence and institutional control. A temporary nurse with questionable boundaries wasn't going to threaten that. He had no idea who was actually standing in his hospital. He had no idea that the woman he was carefully documenting for removal had held the lives of entire fire teams in her hands, had made impossible decisions at 2 a.m. in compounds that were actively being dismantled by precision strikes, had survived things that would have liquefied the spine of an ordinary person. He had no idea that she was watching him, too. The Thursday morning rain hammered the hospital windows like someone demanding entry. Rachel stood at the supply counter reviewing Derek's chart, her fingers tracing the amputation notes with the precision of someone reading a foreign language she'd learned long ago. 2 days since Ashford's public humiliation in the corridors. 2 days of break rooms emptying when she arrived, of charts mysteriously disappearing from the rack, of Dr. Ashford moving through rounds like a man building a case. She could feel the institutional machinery grinding into motion around her, the kind of machinery that required paperwork, witnesses, documentation. He was being strategic now. Competent. That made him more dangerous than the anger had. Derek was scheduled for a routine dressing change at 9:08 a.m. Just a removal of the old sterile bandaging around his amputation site, assessment of the wound healing, fresh dressing applied. 15 minutes of work. Rachel had performed this procedure 43 times in the past 6 weeks. Her hands could do it blindfolded. At 9:41 a.m., Derek's mother stood in the doorway of his room, rain-dampened coat draped over her arm. "He's been asking for you specifically," she said quietly. "He won't let anyone else near the wound. Says you understand something the others don't." Rachel nodded once, that small economical gesture she'd perfected. Mrs. Chen lingered, searching Rachel's face as if looking for confirmation of something she'd already decided to believe. "You're not just a nurse, are you?" Rachel prepared the sterile field without answering. Gauze pads arranged with geometric precision. Saline bottles positioned within exact reach. Gloves snapped on with the sound of preparation. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical hum overhead, and outside, the rain continued its assault on the glass. Derek lay propped at a 45-degree angle, his remaining leg extended, the amputation site wrapped in aging dressing that had turned a faint rust color at the edges. His eyes tracked her movements with the kind of intensity that belonged to someone who'd learned to see threats before they arrived. When she approached the bed, he spoke quietly, voice careful. "I've been having dreams," he said. "About Tikrit. About an explosion. About someone pulling me from rubble." His eyes locked onto hers. "About a woman in uniform." Her face was covered in dust, but her hands were steady. "Do you ever have dreams like that, Rachel?" Rachel's hands moved to his wound site, beginning the careful process of removing the old dressing. The adhesive tape released with small whispers of separation. "Trauma can cause fragmented memories," she said, each word measured, controlled. "Particularly in pediatric patients. The brain fills in details that may not be accurate." But her hands trembled. It was microscopic, a single millimeter of deviation in her grip on the tape edge, there and gone in less than a second. But Derek saw it. His mother would have seen it too, if she hadn't been pulled from the room by a nursing assistant at that exact moment, directed to wait in the family consultation area while the procedure was performed. Convenient timing. Ashford's influence, Rachel thought. He was orchestrating the moment, clearing the witnesses who might contradict his version of events. She removed the last section of dressing and froze. Beneath the tissue, bulging against the fragile barrier of healing skin, was a pulsating mass the size of a grape. The femoral artery. Not rupturing yet, but fractured. Weakened. The pseudoaneurysm, a false sac formed when the arterial wall began to fail, was expanding with each heartbeat. Rachel's training recognized it instantly, a ticking clock made of human tissue. "Derek, don't move," she said, and there was no tremor in her voice now. Just authority. The kind of authority that belonged to someone used to commanding in absolute darkness. She reached for the call button to alert Ashford and the surgical team. That was the protocol. That was the standard of care. That was how things were supposed to happen in a civilized hospital in San Diego in the 21st century. The pseudoaneurysm ruptured before her finger touched the button. The bleeding was catastrophic and immediate. Arterial blood, bright red and pressurized, sprayed across the sterile field in rhythmic spurts that corresponded perfectly with Derek's heartbeat. Once. Twice. A third time. The entire right side of the bed flooded in seconds. Rachel's training calculated in real time, class for hemorrhage, probable exsanguination in 3 minutes, surgical team was 7 floors away and would need another minute just to elevate her up. Derek had maybe 180 seconds before his brain stopped receiving adequate oxygen. Derek's mother screamed from somewhere down the corridor. Someone had brought her back, or she'd fought her way back, or the universe had simply decided that witnesses were necessary. Her voice cracked against the hospital walls like breaking glass. Ashford appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, his careful documentation of Rachel's incompetence forgotten in the face of arterial hemorrhage. For one perfect moment, his face showed exactly what he was, a man who'd never performed emergency medicine, who'd built his authority on paperwork and politics rather than blood and survival. He froze. "Call surgical." His voice cracked on the second word. "Get a team up here now." "Stat!" Rachel didn't waste time responding. She shoved past him, physically moved his body aside with her shoulder, an action that was neither request nor suggestion but pure command, and grabbed the trauma cart. Her hands moved with mechanical precision that belonged to a different world, a world where gentleness was a luxury and speed was salvation. She tore open a thoracotomy kit with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 17 times before, in compounds that were actively being dismantled by precision strikes, under fire, in darkness. "What are you doing?" Ashford's voice had risen to something between a shout and a whimper. "You can't, that's not protocol." Rachel didn't answer him. Her hands didn't have time for words. She positioned herself at Derek's bedside, scalpel in her right hand, her posture shifting into something primal and focused. The knife was a 15-blade, small and sharp, designed for precision work. She made the incision with a single confident motion, opening the tissue directly above the ruptured artery, her movements carrying the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd performed this procedure while bullets impacted concrete inches from her face. Blood everywhere. The room smelled like iron and copper and something like ozone. Beneath the bright surgical lights, the wound opened like a flower blooming in fast motion. Rachel's eyes narrowed to absolute focus. The artery was visible now, the site of rupture obvious, the vessel wall compromised, the spray of blood continuing in weaker pulses as Derek's pressure began to drop. She reached for forceps from the crash cart, not the standard surgical clamps but household hemostatic forceps, the kind she'd used in field medicine when proper equipment was a memory. She clamped the artery with a motion that was part surgery, part ancient ritual, her hands moving on their own while her voice barked orders like she was commanding a fire team in Helmand Province. "I need suction here, now." A young resident jumped as if shocked, moving on her authority without question, without hesitation. The smaller clamp, the one in the green pack. A nurse Rachel had never spoken to before rushed to obey, hands shaking but moving. "I don't. Now." Rachel's voice was ice and granite. "We have 90 seconds. The second clamp went on with a soft metallic sound. The bleeding stopped. Not gradually. Not with mercy. But completely, as if someone had flipped a switch from chaos to order. Derek's vital signs stabilized on the monitors, the oxygen saturation climbing, 71. 78, 84. His heart rate dropping from the panicked thunder of 148 to something closer to actual sinus rhythm. His blood pressure rising from the dangerous 67/41 that had nearly killed him to something that would keep his brain alive. The room went dead silent except for the percussion of the monitors and the continuing assault of rain against the windows. Rachel held pressure above and below the wound site, her arms absolutely steady, blood soaked to her elbows, her scrubs transformed into something that looked like she'd bathed in a wound. Derek's eyes stayed open, locked on her face, and in that moment something passed between them, some recognition that had nothing to do with dreams or fragmented memories but everything to do with the specific knowledge that only comes when someone chooses to save your life instead of following the rulebook. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Ashford. The worst part was that in the moment before Rachel moved, before she shoved him aside and revealed the capabilities he'd been documenting as grounds for termination, he saw something shift in her posture. He saw her shoulders drop from the posture of a temp nurse into the posture of someone accustomed to command. He saw her hands move through a procedure that didn't exist in the civilian medical playbook. He saw her voice change, drop an octave, lose all deference, become something that sounded like military bearing given human form. He saw, in other words, that he had been wrong about exactly who he was trying to destroy. The surgical team arrived 43 seconds later, running through the doors like they were responding to a general quarters alarm. But Derek Chen was stable. His artery was clamped. His bleeding had stopped. The immediate threat had passed. Rachel stepped back from the bedside with the same economical movement she'd used to enter it, her face perfectly composed, her eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance. "Femoral artery pseudoaneurysm," she said to the surgical team leader, speaking in the clinical language of someone who'd briefed commanders on casualty assessments. "Ruptured during routine dressing change. Field clamping performed with household forceps pending surgical intervention. O2 sat 92 and stable. Heart rate 84. Pressure 108/70. Is yours." The surgical team moved into motion, their protocol-driven efficiency replacing her expertise, taking over the case with the authority of a complete surgical suite waiting upstairs. It was exactly how it was supposed to work. Derek was wheeled out toward the OR with his mother running beside the gurney, her hand reaching for her son's, and in that moment she was no longer thinking about dreams or recognition or the strange steady competence of a temp nurse. She was thinking about her child being alive. Ashford stood rooted to the spot, his mouth slightly open, watching Rachel clean the wound debris from her hands with the careful attention of someone who'd been trained to handle biohazards. She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge his presence or his frozen shock or the rapid recalculation happening behind his eyes. She simply threw away her gloves, changed her blood-soaked scrubs in the staff bathroom, and returned to the unit to finish charting the incident with mechanical precision. But as she wrote, Ashford made his phone calls. Not to congratulate her. Not to acknowledge what he'd witnessed. But to initiate what he'd been building toward for 3 months, the paperwork that would have her removed by the end of business. She'd saved Derek's life. That was undeniable. That was on video. That was witnessed by 6 people. But she'd also violated scope of practice, performed a procedure without explicit attending authorization, and used equipment in a manner not approved by hospital protocol. She'd challenged his authority in front of staff. She'd crossed a line that Dr. Ashford had carefully drawn and then reinforced with every administrator he had on speed dial. By 2:17 p.m., the termination paperwork was already in motion. And Rachel Torres was still charting, still focused, her single dog tag hidden beneath her scrubs, the broken chain pressing against her chest like a weight she'd been carrying for 2 decades and still had no permission to set down. The surgical team arrived at Derek's bedside at 2:14 p.m., a vascular surgeon named Dr. Patricia Chen and 2 surgical residents moving with the controlled urgency of people who'd seen hemorrhagic shock before. Rachel stepped back, hands still gloved, blood dried on her forearms in a pattern that looked almost like tattoos. The surgeon's eye swept the field, the exposed artery, the household forceps clamping what should have been a fatal bleed, the 4 lines Rachel had already established running wide open. Dr. Chen's voice cut through the monitor's electronic symphony. Who set this clamp? The trauma nurse, someone answered. Patricia Chen bent closer, examining Rachel's work with the intensity of a jeweler studying a diamond. The forceps held steady. The exposure was textbook, surgical precision under circumstances that should have produced panic. She looked up, directly at Rachel. This is a field thoracotomy with a combat clamp technique. Where did you learn this? Rachel didn't answer. She was already removing her gloves, moving toward the door to give the surgical team room. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing remained even. Pain was information. Control was everything. You saved his life, Dr. Chen said quietly. Whatever happens next, you saved him. But Ashford had already left the room. She'd seen him slip out 12 minutes earlier, his phone already in his hand, his jaw set with the expression of a man making calls that would change everything. 3 minutes after that, she heard him in the hallway outside Derek's room. Yes, I'm aware we have liability concerns. Yes, I understand the board's investment in our reputation. No, I'm not asking permission. I'm informing you. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electric hymn. By 5:56 p.m., Rachel was summoned to the administrator's office on the 4th floor. Not paged. Not asked. A security guard appeared at her station. Dr. Ashford needs to see you. Now. The office was cold and precise, mahogany desk, leather chairs, a painting of the hospital founder on the wall looking like he'd never made a mistake in his life. Ashford sat behind the desk. Beside him sat the hospital's legal counsel, a woman with a face like a closing door, papers arranged in front of her in neat stacks. Ashford's voice was almost gentle, which made it worse than if he'd shouted. Miss Torres, we appreciate your initiative today. Your quick thinking, your composure under pressure. But we need to be honest about what happened in that trauma bay. He folded his hands. You performed a surgical procedure. Artery clamping. Field exposure. These are physician-level interventions. You don't have the licensure for that. You practiced beyond your scope. Rachel sat perfectly still. The dog tag beneath her scrubs felt heavier than it ever had. The legal counsel shuffled papers. Our liability insurance has specific limitations. A nurse performing surgical procedures, however successful the outcome, creates exposure for the hospital. We have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately. Rachel's voice, when she spoke, was exactly level. I saved his life. Nevertheless, the counsel said, not meeting her eyes, liability concerns require. I understand. Rachel stood. I'll clear my locker. Ashford personally escorted her? This was the detail that revealed his character most clearly, not the termination itself, but the fact that he walked beside her down the hallway, down the stairs, through the staff corridor toward the employee lockers. His presence was like walking beside a smiling shark, the kind of predator that doesn't need to bare its teeth because the message was already written in its movements. "You're a capable nurse, Rachel," he said, his voice almost concerned. "Really, you are. But hospitals have hierarchies for a reason. Structure. Chain of command. These exist to protect patients. I hope you find somewhere that suits your particular skills." She said nothing. She opened her locker, the same locker she'd used for 3 months, the one that never accumulated the photos or personal items that other nurses added to theirs. She removed the cracked mug someone had given her with Sacred Heart printed in faded letters. The small succulent plant she'd kept on the break room windowsill, the one nobody else would water. A folder with 3 reference letters from her previous temporary positions, each one carefully vague. A cardboard box appeared. Ashford held it open, watching her pack. His smile never wavered. "The 3 nurses who were in the trauma bay with you," he said quietly. "Jennifer Martinez, Marcus Washington, and Wei Song. They're being reassigned effective immediately." Rachel's hands paused for a fraction of a second. Long enough for him to see. Jennifer's moving to night shift ICU on the 3rd floor. Marcus to pediatrics. Wei to the cardiac unit on 5. Different floors. Different schedules. He tilted his head slightly. "We can't have people discussing patient care details outside their direct responsibility. Protocol violation, you understand." They weren't discussing anything. They would have supported her. They'd seen exactly what she did. Rachel placed the cardboard box against her hip and walked toward the exit. Ashford didn't follow her this time. He didn't need to. He'd already won. The parking lot was coming alive with the late afternoon heat, the kind of San Diego sun that burned without mercy. But beyond the lot, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, the kind that meant rain by evening. Rachel walked to the bus stop on 7th Avenue, the same stop she'd used 3 months ago when she first arrived at Sacred Heart, when she was still running, still hiding, still waiting for the next city where nobody would ask about her past. She stood under the shelter, cardboard box balanced against her hip. Inside it, a cracked mug. A dying succulent. A photograph of 12 people in desert camouflage, taken outside a compound in Helmand Province. All of them gone now. Dead or discharged or scattered to the wind, their identities dissolved into the machinery of classification and sealed records. And one dog tag on a broken chain, hanging beneath her scrubs, carrying the name of a child who'd become a man she'd saved twice, once in Tikrit when he was 8 years old, and once today in a trauma bay at Sacred Heart. The buses arrived and departed. 6:15 p.m. 6:24 p.m. 7:22 p.m. She didn't board any of them. She stood in the shelter, watching the rain begin, first as scattered drops, then as a proper deluge, the kind that hammered the pavement like applause for something terrible. 20 years. 20 years of careful anonymity, of temp positions and rental apartments and no phone that could be traced. 20 years of watching children who looked like that boy grow up on screens, wondering if he survived Tikrit, if he became something whole or something broken. And in one moment, one surgical moment where she'd let her training show, her hands move without permission from her civilian identity, she'd surfaced enough for Ashford to see her as a threat. Now she was out. And Ashford was already inside his office on the 4th floor, her termination file open on his computer screen, his fingers moving with the confident precision of someone erasing evidence. He adjusted her dates of employment. He backdated performance concerns. He created a paper trail documenting protocol violations that had never existed, embedding them into her record so thoroughly that if anyone ever requested her file, all they would find was a pattern of insubordination justified by today's incident rather than contradicted by it. He pulled up her schedule records and altered them, showing absences that never occurred, shifts where her charting was supposedly incomplete. He was methodical. Confident. A surgeon operating on institutional paperwork with the same precision a real surgeon operates on flesh. What Ashford didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the moment his fingers touched those federal personnel records, silent alarms had already begun to trigger in offices he'd never heard of. Rachel Torres was a protected operative. Her records were flagged at the FBI's Virginia Cyber Division. Every alteration he made to her file, every keystroke that modified the protected database of a former federal operative, tripped security protocols that had been waiting for exactly this kind of intrusion for 20 years. In a secure facility outside Arlington, an FBI agent named Lisa Nakamura was sitting at a bank of monitors when the alert appeared. She sat up. She read the notification twice. She picked up a phone that connected directly to her supervisor. "Sir, we have a breach on Torres. Someone's altering her federal file from inside a hospital in San Diego." The rain fell heavier on the bus stop shelter. Rachel stood with her cardboard box, soaked clothes beginning to cling to her frame, and wondered if she'd finally run out of places to hide. If the cost of saving a child's life was finally going to be the exposure of the ghost she'd spent 2 decades learning to be. She had no idea what was already in motion. No idea that the feds were pulling up Ashford's personnel records, his financial statements, his board connections. No idea that somewhere in San Diego, Derek Chen was telling his father everything, the story of a woman who'd pulled him from rubble in Tikrit, who'd disappeared into classified obscurity, and who'd somehow resurface as a temp nurse in the same city where his adopted parents lived. No idea that 72 hours from now, everything would change. The rain kept falling. She kept standing. And behind her, in the secure federal offices that existed to protect people like her, the machinery of justice was beginning to turn. The hospital board convened 72 hours later in a conference room on the executive floor, fluorescent lights casting everything in institutional white. Derek's father had made the threat clear: lawsuit, media, federal inquiry into negligence protocols. Sacred Heart moved fast when legal exposure materialized. 7 board members sat in leather chairs arranged in a semicircle. Dr. Marcus Ashford stood at the head of the table in a charcoal suit that cost more than most nurses earned in a month, his posture the picture of wounded professionalism. He'd prepared for this. The falsified timeline was meticulous. Personnel files altered with surgical precision. Schedule records adjusted to show Rachel's documented incompetence across 3 separate incidents: medication delays, charting errors, protocol violations. All of it fabricated. All of it airtight. He began speaking with the controlled authority of a man who'd successfully intimidated hospital boards before. His voice carried the weight of 30 years of institutional power. The files he distributed showed Rachel's purported negligence, the incident report from her termination, documentation of her practicing beyond scope during Derek's emergency. He'd even secured written statements from 2 nurses, bought with subtle threats about their own compliance records. The board members reviewed the materials with the careful expressions of people protecting institutional liability. Ashford's narrative was seamless. Professional. Damning. The decision would take 1 vote. Then the conference room doors opened. Derek Chen wheeled through in his chair, propelling himself with the upper body strength of a man who'd been training hard for this moment. His father followed, carrying a manila folder thick with documents. Derek rolled directly to the center of the semicircle and locked his eyes on Rachel's chair, which sat empty because she'd been excluded from this hearing, the way the powerless always are. He turned his wheelchair to face Dr. Ashford. The hospital director's expression shifted. Confusion flickered across his face like a warning light he didn't understand. Derek's voice emerged quiet, controlled, carrying the weight of someone used to giving orders in lethal situations. "Angel." That was all he said at first. Just 1 word, whispered like a prayer. Then his voice strengthened, steadied, became the voice of a soldier at attention. "That's Major Torres. She pulled me out of a building in Tikrit when I was 8 years old. She shielded my body with her own. There was sniper fire. She took shrapnel." The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Ashford's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been folded on the table with practiced composure, suddenly pressed flat. One of the board members, the chief of surgery, a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair, leaned forward. "That's not possible." Derek's father stepped forward and opened the folder. Inside was a classified after-action report, stamped with security clearances, bearing the seal of a command authority most of them had never heard of. 20 years. That's how long Derek's father had searched for documentation proving what had happened to his son that day. The report detailed the extraction, the hostage situation, the American soldier who'd sheltered a bleeding child under fire. All of it marked and verified. The report had Rachel's name on it. Major Rachel Torres. The room began to rotate. Board members exchanged looks, the kind that said their entire understanding of this situation had inverted in 30 seconds. Then the video screen flickered on. A Navy SEAL commander appeared on the monitor, his background clearly a secure location, the kind of place most civilians never saw. His voice carried the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I served under Major Torres in Theater Command. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines attached to JSOC Task Force 121. She was the finest combat medic I've ever worked with." He paused, his eyes reflecting light off the secure room behind him. Bronze Star with Valor. 2 Silver Stars. Purple Heart. She received those medals for actions in Tikrit in 2003. His voice dropped lower. When her unit was dissolved for political reasons, she was ordered to disappear. That was 20 years ago. That order came from above my pay grade. The screen went dark. Ashford stood up. His carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time, and everyone in that room was watching it happen. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The door opened again. An FBI agent in a dark suit entered, flanked by 2 colleagues. His badge caught the fluorescent light, Federal Bureau of Investigation. His voice was measured, procedural, the voice of someone delivering indictments. "Dr. Marcus Ashford, we've been investigating you for 3 weeks following detection of falsified federal documents. Specifically, you altered and forged the personnel records of Major Rachel Torres, a protected operative classified under the Defense Information Security Act. That constitutes a federal felony." Ashford's face went the color of old bone. The agent continued without inflection. "You're under arrest for falsifying documents pertaining to a protected operative, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to interfere with federal personnel. You have the right to remain silent." The handcuffs appeared. They made a sound like breaking glass as they clicked around Ashford's wrists. He didn't resist. He seemed to be experiencing something between shock and slow realization, the moment a man understands that his power was always borrowed, his authority always contingent, his carefully constructed kingdom built on sand. The board members watched in silence as the agents escorted him toward the door. Ashford's eyes found the chief of surgery for a moment, some last appeal to the old boys network that had sustained him. She looked away. He'd poisoned too many wells for loyalty to matter now. They took him through the hospital lobby at 4:15 in the afternoon, right at shift change, when maximum staff were moving through the hallways. Nurses froze mid-stride. Physicians stopped with coffee cups halfway to their mouths. The elegant Dr. Ashford, who'd ruled Sacred Heart's trauma unit with contemptuous authority, shuffled in handcuffs past the reception desk, past the gift shop, past the portraits of distinguished physicians on the wall of excellence where his own photo hung in position of honor. Someone pulled out a phone. The video would be on local news within an hour. Jennifer, one of the nurses who'd avoided Rachel in the break room, watched from the second-floor balcony. Her hands pressed against the railing, tears streaming down her face. Not sadness. Grief for the woman who should have been vindicated months ago. Shame for how easily she'd accepted the lie. But Rachel Torres was gone. She'd learned long ago that when the machinery of justice started turning, you didn't wait to see if it would crush you. You disappeared. By the time the hospital board convened their emergency evening meeting to void her termination and issue formal apologies, Rachel's apartment was empty. Lease terminated. The cardboard box from her firing sat on the counter with its 3 contents, a cracked mug, a dying succulent, and that photograph of her unit, all packed and ready. Derek searched for her. His father made calls. But Major Rachel Torres had vanished as thoroughly as she had 20 years ago in Tikrit, sliding back into the shadow network of protected operatives where she'd been trained to exist. The hospital moved quickly to contain damage. The termination was voided. Full back pay issued within 48 hours. A formal written apology drafted and signed by all 7 board members, each signature a tiny capitulation to the reality they'd missed. The Torres Trauma Unit would be renamed within months. A bronze plaque commissioned. A dedication ceremony scheduled. But the woman the unit was named after had already become a ghost again, just when everyone expected her to step into the light. What the hospital didn't know, what none of them understood yet, was that ghosts, when properly trained, can choose when to materialize. 6 weeks later, someone spotted Dr. Marcus Ashford at a strip mall in East San Diego, sitting at a folding table between a nail salon and a tax preparation office. The sign in front of him read, "Supplemental insurance, coverage you can trust." He wore a short-sleeve button-down with a clip-on tie, badly knotted. His hair needed cutting. When someone walked past, he tried his old commanding voice, "Excuse me, can I talk to you about your insurance needs?" They kept walking. He slumped in the folding chair alone, surrounded by brochures nobody wanted. The medical board had suspended his license pending investigation. The hospital had fired him for cause, the falsified records constituted fraud. His wife filed for divorce within a week, apparently his need to control extended into every room he occupied. His carefully cultivated board relationships evaporated overnight. Nobody returned his calls. The colleagues who once deferred to his authority crossed the street to avoid eye contact. His world had contracted from one of influence and fear to 4 square feet of vinyl folding chair under a parking lot sun. Jennifer, the nurse who'd watched him being escorted out in handcuffs, spotted him 6 weeks later while grabbing lunch. She stood in the parking lot for a long moment, watching him pitch insurance to people who were looking at him like he was nobody. She thought about taking a photo, posting it with a caption about karma. Instead, she just walked away. Some falls are punishment enough without amplification. True class is what you do when the lights go out. When nobody's watching. When there's no reward. When doing the right thing costs you everything. That's when you find out who you really are. And in the darkness of that truth, Rachel Torres made her choice. Like and subscribe if you love stories about people who've been underestimated. Comment below if you've ever had someone doubt you and you proved them wrong. Let's get back to it.